So in the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about what I see as what it feels like when I go to clinic in regard to usage of EHRs. Next slide, please. So I think that it is important to remember that for old people like me, there was a day before EHRs when we had paper charts, which frequently were misplaced, or important things like labs hadn't been filed. And these were tough days. We lived through them. And so the EHR, as Mia has described, is a tremendous advance. But I do think that we need to take it to the next level. Next slide. For those of us who practice, we live our clinical lives in the EHR. That's where we find our data. That's where we document what's happened during our encounters with patients. That's where we interact with patients through portals and interact with our team as well. And truly, it is all-encompassing for the clinician. Next slide. Now, oncology practice, we all think our own practices are most important. Now, oncology practice is a high-risk, high-stakes practice. The treatments that we use are toxic. Patients' health is on the line. And as Mia said, safety is a major issue for oncology, and EHRs have helped in many ways, though I think there's more that we could do. Mia also stressed that we have new diagnostics, new therapeutics. It seems like every week a new drug is approved by the FDA, and our care is increasingly multidisciplinary between the major clinical specialties as well as the supportive specialties like radiology, pathology. We live in a time-pressured world. If we saw one patient a day, some of the problems with EHRs wouldn't be a problem. But for those of us who are seeing many patients in a day, it is, again, an added stress. And we have increasingly administrative roles that do not directly involve patients, either documentation or pre-authorizations or arranging consultants. All of that is important, but may be in some respects more difficult than it needs to be. Next slide. So what's wrong with the current general EHRs? Mia mentioned that they're created to serve all specialties, resulting in what some of us would say is the lowest common denominator of specialization. We certainly have some specialization in the EHR, but there's a lot of aspects to it that detract from that. There's a focus on billing compliance, and that can't be overestimated. It's really a problem. And while the power of EHRs is that there's so much patient data available, it's also a curse. And there are many hands messing with the data, so to speak. And for those of us who practice, the problem list is a good example of something that gets very messy as different providers interact with it. Critical data is often hidden or difficult to find or not found at all, which makes decision-making more difficult and sometimes less safe. And again, this all must be taken in the context of a busy clinic schedule. Next slide. So Atul Gawande wrote this article, The Bell Curve, in 2004. And he says, what happens when patients find out how good their doctors really are? And he talks about really what makes high quality medicine. The next slide. And my interpretation of the article is that medical outcomes are the sum of many parts, many details, that people are critical and systems are critical. And the quality is a result of the confluence of both people and the systems. And the EHR is obviously a major system that supports cancer care. Next slide. And then Atul, a number of years ago, wrote this article about his own experiences with the EHR in his hospital. He said, after 3 years, I've come to feel that a system that promised to increase my mastery over my work has instead increased my work's mastery over me. And I'm not the only one. And he goes on to explain in detail really how this affects how we practice. Next slide. And he talks about one of the primary care doctors who he works with, Susan Sanduki, who talked about her daily battle with their epic inbasket, which she says clogged to the point of dysfunction. Their messages from patients messages with lab and radiology results, messages from colleagues, messages from administrators, automated messages not responding to previous messages, and all the letters from specialists. And she just basically, she can't deal with it, and she deletes many of them unread. She says, I hope to God if there's something going on that needed my attention, they would send me an email. In short, she hopes they'll try to reach her at yet another inbox. Next slide. This is from my own institution, from Penn, and this is a number of in-basket messages for the hematology oncology practices, just that specialty. The red line is the beginning of the pandemic, and currently we're seeing about 40,000 in-basket messages a month for our hematology oncology faculty, really a staggering number that support what Susan was mentioning in the previous slide. It's gotten much worse during the pandemic, as Mia has mentioned. Next slide. So the quality of cancer care, we try hard. All of us, I think, want to provide high quality care, but our therapies are complex, our systems are complex, and they make this challenging. In the end, systems must support, not thwart, high quality care. And I think we need to think about this when we think about how EHRs are designed. Next slide. So why are some industries much safer than medicine? How do EHRs factor into safety? And what are the principles of safety that should drive EHR design? Next slide. So this is obviously the inside of a modern passenger jet. And the airline industry is extremely safe. It's really got an incredible record when you think about it. But there's a message here. And if you look at the main instruments in front of the pilots, there are very few of them. They provide the absolutely most critical data that a pilot needs to have when he's flying the airplane. And sometimes decisions need to be made quite quickly, and he doesn't need to look for those data. They're right in front of him, unencumbered by other data. If you look at the ceiling, you can see that there are dozens and dozens of switches. Everything's there at their fingertips, so to speak, but the critical data is presented right in their faces, unobstructed. Next slide. So when I think about it, I think the data has to be unencumbered by unneeded information. That's currently not the case in most EHRs. It has to be displayed in a maximally accessible way, which is also not the case. It has to be displayed without ambiguity, and there need to be longitudinal displays when appropriate. Next slide. So what are the critical data? There's a long list of them. These are just some examples. These again are cancer focused, but cancer stage, pathology, radiology labs, the longitudinal cancer journey, and outside data. Next slide. So in this article, the authors looked at health record use, productivity, and their association with turnover, and they said that physicians spend about 5.5 hours on EHR time for every 8 hours of clinic time, and that's a lot. And for many physicians, that's what we call pajama time. After the kids go to sleep, they sit there and do their notes from the clinic earlier in the day. They also noticed, though, that physicians with the lower utilization metrics were more likely to leave. They just wouldn't deal with the EHRs. Next slide. And in this viewpoint that was published in 2021 in JAMA, it said the EHR has the potential for benefit, harm, and burden. And we must optimize EHR design, implementation, and regulation, which currently is partly true, I think, but not entirely true. And they say, how did it happen that the electronic health record emerged as a concern regarding clinicians' well-being, and what is the path forward? Increasing evidence indicates that EHR is posing an intolerable burden on clinicians and may be degrading rather than elevating clinical care. Next slide. Is it the HR situation getting better or worse? Some of us would say it's getting worse. We always add things to the HR. We never take things away. Regulatory and institutional requirements get more complicated. And as we've mentioned, increasing complexity of care with genomics and diagnostics and so on are increasingly burdensome. Some people would say this is death by 100 clicks or cuts. And patient portals also are great, but as I mentioned earlier, are increasing the burden. Next slide. This is what radiology listing looks like in one EHR. If you go to the next slide, we created a shell over the EHR, which has pulled out the impressions from different imaging procedures in a much more accessible way. These are things that we can do, but have not been done to date with EHRs. Next slide. And likewise, on the right, you can pull out all the pathology reports, just the impressions. That would be very accessible. And each one of those you can click to get to the full report. But currently, you have to search through EHRs forever to find your pathology reports. We can do much better than that. Next slide. And I would just end by reminding people that the oncology care force is under tremendous pressure. This is from a previous workshop that the National Cancer Policy Forum ran, where the number of cancer patients is outgrowing the number of oncology clinicians. And it says increasing the efficiency with which oncology clinicians provide high quality care may be the only solution that will allow clinicians to care for more patients without extending work hours. To accomplish this goal, we need to reverse trends noted previously, and one of those are the way EHRs work. We need to do better. We can do better. And with that, I'll end, and thank you very much.